The rain was relentless as I pulled into the gravel driveway of the Airbnb. My windshield wipers struggled against the downpour, smearing the view of a quaint two-story house perched on the edge of a dense forest. It was the only place I could find last minute for my work trip, and though the photos online had been inviting, something about seeing it in person made me hesitate. The house was older than I expected, with peeling white paint and a single porch light flickering weakly in the storm. I grabbed my bag and dashed through the rain to the front door. A damp envelope taped to the doorframe greeted me. "Welcome, Liam. Key inside." The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. I opened it, retrieved the key, and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of mildew and wood polish. The interior was cozy enough, rustic furniture, warm lighting, but there was an odd stillness to the place. It felt like I'd walked into someone else's life, frozen in time. A grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner, its pendulum swinging with unnerving precision. I settled into room 13, which was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway upstairs. The number hung crookedly on the door, as if someone had tried to rip it off but gave up halfway through. Inside, the room was simple. A bed with a patchwork quilt, an antique dresser, and a window overlooking the dark forest. The storm outside had intensified. Rain lashed against the glass like desperate fingers. As I unpacked my laptop and charger, I heard it, a faint creak from somewhere in the house. It wasn't unusual for old homes to groan under bad weather, but this sounded deliberate, like footsteps moving slowly across wooden floorboards. I froze for a moment, listening. Nothing followed. Shaking off the unease, I turned on my laptop and began answering emails. The Wi-Fi was surprisingly fast. At least that was one thing going right tonight. But then came another sound, a soft tap, tap, tap from above me. My eyes darted to the ceiling. Was there an attic? The listing hadn't mentioned one. I stood up and paced around the room, trying to locate the source of the noise. It stopped abruptly as soon as I moved toward the door. Hours passed uneventfully, or so I thought. Around midnight, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the wall opposite me. My breath hitched as I sat up straight and stared at it. Nothing moved now except for the faint flicker of light from my bedside lamp. "Just tired," I muttered to myself. But then came another sound, this time unmistakable. A low whispering echoing down the hallway outside my room. It wasn't words exactly. It was more like fragmented syllables strung together in a haunting melody. I grabbed my phone and turned on its flashlight before opening my door cautiously. The hallway stretched out before me like a tunnel into darkness. The whispering stopped as soon as I stepped out. "Hello?" My voice cracked slightly. No response. I checked every room upstairs, empty, and locked myself back in room 13 with trembling hands. At 3 a.m., something woke me, a sharp knock on my window pane. My heart thundered as I sat up in bed and stared at it. The rain had stopped now. Moonlight illuminated the forest beyond. And something else. A figure stood just outside my window, a gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes staring directly at me through the glass. I scrambled backward off the bed and reached for my phone to call for help, but when I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. Then came another knock, this time from inside my room. I whipped around to see shadows pooling unnaturally in one corner near the dresser. They twisted and writhed like living things until they coalesced into a humanoid shape. A tall figure with elongated limbs and no face. It lunged toward me without warning. I screamed and threw myself toward the door, fumbling with its lock as icy fingers grazed my shoulder. The touch burned like frostbite. Pain shot through me as I managed to wrench open the door and sprint down the hallway. The house itself seemed alive now. Walls groaned as if breathing, doors slammed shut behind me. Whispers erupted all around, like a chorus of unseen voices urging me to stay. I reached the front door just as those elongated fingers wrapped around my ankle and yanked me backward onto the floorboards. Desperate, I kicked wildly until my foot connected with something solid. The thing hissed in pain and recoiled just enough for me to break free. I didn't stop running until I reached my car and peeled out of that driveway into the night. Hours later, safe in a motel miles away from that cursed house, I opened my laptop to leave a review warning others about room 13. But when I logged on to Airbnb, the listing was gone. No trace of it remained, not even in my booking history. As exhaustion overtook me, I glanced at myself in the mirror above the motel sink and froze. On my shoulder, where that thing had touched me, was a handprint burned deep into my skin. I arrived at the Airbnb late in the afternoon, tired from a long drive and eager to unwind. The loft was tucked away in a historic district surrounded by cobblestone streets and old brick buildings. It had been advertised as a sleek, modern space with plenty of charm, and the photos online had been stunning. When I stepped inside, I wasn't disappointed. The place was immaculate. The loft had high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and large windows that let in the golden light of the setting sun. A bottle of red wine sat on the kitchen counter next to a handwritten note from the host. "Welcome, Alex. Enjoy your stay. Please note, the door to the mirror room stays locked. Do not attempt to enter." I frowned at the last line. The listing hadn't mentioned anything about a locked room. Curiosity tugged at me, but I brushed it off. It wasn't uncommon for hosts to keep certain spaces private. Maybe it was just storage or an office they didn't want guests snooping around in. After unpacking my things, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto the plush couch in the living room. The loft was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed after weeks of stress. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted slightly. The loft felt bigger somehow, emptier than it had during the day. The city lights outside cast strange shadows on the walls, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. Around 10 p.m., as I sat scrolling through my phone, I heard it, a faint creaking sound coming from somewhere above me. It wasn't rhythmic like footsteps. It was sporadic, like something swaying or shifting. My eyes darted to the ceiling, but it was solid concrete. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "Old building noises," I muttered to myself. But then came another sound, a soft tapping noise that seemed to come from behind one of the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent enough to make me uneasy. I tried to ignore it and focus on my phone, but every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow near the window, or a flicker near the hallway mirror that hung opposite the living room. Unable to shake my growing unease, I decided to explore the loft before heading to bed. The place had an open floor plan, except for one door tucked away in a corner, the mirror room. The door was plain white with a brass handle, and though it didn't look particularly special, something about it felt off. It wasn't just that it was locked. It was how it seemed almost out of place in an otherwise modern space. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. Was someone inside? I pressed my ear against the door, but heard nothing, no tapping or creaking this time. As I turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow reflected in the hallway mirror behind me. My pulse quickened as I spun around, but there was nothing there. That night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this place. The creaking sounds returned intermittently throughout the night, louder now, and accompanied by faint whispers that seemed just out of reach. At one point, I woke up suddenly and realized that my bedroom door, which I had closed before going to bed, was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stared at it in the darkness. "Just settling noises," I whispered to myself shakily. But then came another sound, a soft knock on my bedroom window. I froze. The window faced an alleyway 2 stories above ground level. There was no way anyone could be standing outside knocking on it. By morning, my nerves were frayed. Determined not to let paranoia ruin my stay, I decided to distract myself with work and sightseeing. But when I returned later that evening, something had changed. The door to the mirror room was no longer locked. It stood slightly ajar now, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond its threshold. I hesitated before stepping closer. "Hello?" My voice echoed weakly into the room. No response. Inside was a single object, an enormous antique mirror leaning against one wall. Its ornate frame gleamed faintly in the dim light spilling in from the hallway, and its surface seemed impossibly dark, like staring into an abyss rather than a reflection. As I stepped closer, movement rippled across its surface, and suddenly my reflection appeared, but something was wrong. The figure in the mirror wore my clothes but had hollow eyes and an unnerving grin that stretched far too wide across its face. It raised its hand slowly and waved at me. Panic surged through me as shadows began spilling out of the mirror's frame like smoke. They twisted unnaturally before forming humanoid shapes that lurched toward me with jerky movements. I stumbled backward out of the room and slammed the door shut behind me. But when I turned around, the shadows were already in the hallway. They moved closer with every flicker of light until they surrounded me completely, whispering in voices that sounded both foreign and familiar all at once. "You shouldn't have opened it," one voice hissed from somewhere behind me. When morning came, sunlight streamed into an empty loft. The host arrived later that day to clean for their next guest. But when they opened room 3's door, they found nothing but Alex's belongings neatly packed on the bed. And one final photograph sitting atop them. It showed Alex standing outside in front of his car, but his face wasn't his own anymore. It bore hollow eyes and an impossibly wide grin etched into its features like scars. The host sighed deeply before tucking away Rule 3's warning for their next guest: do not attempt to enter. I arrived at the Airbnb just as dusk settled over the countryside. The house was a sprawling Victorian structure, its silhouette jagged against the fading orange sky. It looked charming in the listing photos, but now seemed oddly imposing, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. The host had left instructions for self-check-in, and I found the key under a rusted flower pot by the porch. The interior was surprisingly modern: polished wood floors, sleek furniture, and tasteful art on the walls. Yet there was something off about it. The air felt heavy, almost stifling, as though the house itself was holding its breath. A faint smell of damp lingered, despite the spotless appearance. I dropped my bags in the guest room upstairs and noticed a peculiar detail. There were locks on all the doors from the outside, including mine. I brushed it off as an eccentricity of an old home and settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet evening. As I unpacked my things, I heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from somewhere below. It wasn't loud enough to alarm me, but it was persistent, like someone dragging a chair across a wooden floor. I paused and listened closely. It stopped abruptly. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "Old house noises," I muttered to myself. Later, as I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone, I felt it again, an odd sensation of being watched. The room was empty except for me, but every so often, I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow flickering across the far wall, or a curtain swaying slightly when no windows were open. The scraping sound returned that night as I lay in bed. It was louder now, coming from directly beneath my room. My heart raced as I strained to hear more. Was someone downstairs? Unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but my phone's flashlight, I crept down the staircase into the living room. The scraping sound grew louder as I approached a door at the far end of the room, the basement. I hesitated. The host hadn't mentioned anything about a basement in their listing. The door was slightly ajar, revealing steep wooden stairs descending into pitch darkness. The smell of damp was stronger here, mixed with something metallic, like rust or blood. "Hello?" My voice echoed weakly down into the void. No response. I stepped back and shut the door firmly before retreating upstairs to lock myself in my room. Around 3 a.m., I woke to an unmistakable sound, the creak of footsteps outside my door. My pulse quickened as shadows danced under the gap between door and floor. Someone or something was moving in the hallway. I grabbed my phone and dialed the host's number listed in their instructions. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. Then came a knock, slow and deliberate, on my door. "Who's there?" My voice cracked with fear. No answer. The doorknob jiggled violently before stopping altogether. Silence followed for what felt like hours until finally, I mustered enough courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but at its far end stood a figure cloaked in darkness. It didn't move. It simply stared, or at least seemed to stare, with hollow eyes that glinted faintly in the dim light. I slammed the door shut and backed away toward the window, only to find another figure standing outside in the yard below, a gaunt man with pale skin and a twisted smile aimed directly at me. Panicked, I grabbed my bag and bolted out of the room toward the staircase, but halfway down, I froze. The basement door was wide open now, and from its depths came soft whispers that grew louder with each step I took toward freedom. As I reached for the front door handle, icy fingers wrapped around my wrist from behind. I spun around to see one of those figures, its face impossibly close to mine, whispering something unintelligible but somehow familiar, like fragments of my own thoughts spoken aloud by another voice. With all my strength, I broke free and ran out into the night without looking back. At sunrise, exhausted and trembling, I sat in a diner miles away from that cursed house. As I scrolled through Airbnb to report what had happened, the listing had vanished completely from the app. Later that day, when checking my email for confirmation of my stay, I found nothing, not even proof of booking. It was as though I had never been there. But deep inside my bag was something that proved otherwise, an old brass key marked with faded numbers 13 and dried blood smeared across its surface.